The sweltering encounter. It was a sweltering afternoon in the heart of Atlanta. The city buzzed with activity, horns blaring, pedestrians weaving between cars, and voices filling the air. FBI Special Agent Tara Johnson, a well-respected black woman with an unwavering dedication to justice, was behind the wheel, heading back to her office after a grueling day. She'd just concluded a critical meeting with a team tracking a violent drug cartel that had been eluding law enforcement for months. Her instincts, sharpened by years of training and fieldwork, were driving her closer to a breakthrough in the case. She felt tired, but the pride in her work gave her strength. As she navigated through the crowded city streets, a sudden flash of blue lights in her rearview mirror interrupted her thoughts. A police cruiser signaled for her to pull over. Surprised but composed, she double-checked her speed and confirmed she hadn't violated any traffic laws. Perplexed, she pulled over, mentally preparing herself for the interaction. A tall, white police officer with a stern demeanor approached her car. His name had read Officer Daniels. He didn't bother with pleasantries, immediately demanding her license and registration in a tone void of courtesy. Tara maintained her composure, greeting him politely and explaining she was an FBI agent, showing him her badge. However, Daniels barely glanced at it, dismissing her authority with a curt response, "License and registration." His tone was cold, almost daring her to defy him. Realizing the gravity of the situation, Tara again explained her credentials, stating she was on official duty. But Daniels ignored her. Without cause, he demanded she step out of her vehicle. Tara's heart quickened as she sensed a hostile undercurrent in his behavior, an almost palpable disdain. She had encountered difficult officers before, but this felt different, as if there were a personal vendetta driving his actions. Refusing to let fear or anger get the best of her, Tara reluctantly stepped out of the car, keeping her hands visible. Despite the years of experience in high-stress situations, she felt her stomach twist as Daniels grabbed her arm and roughly shoved her against the car. She winced as cold metal clamped down on her wrists, her FBI badge momentarily reflecting in the sunlight. Passers-by began to gather, some recording the interaction, their eyes wide with shock and disbelief. The situation escalated as Daniels taunted her, implying she thought herself above the law because of her FBI status. Tara, feeling the burn of humiliation, tried to reason with him, stating he was making a mistake. But Daniels silenced her with a sneer, dragging her toward the patrol car, ignoring the bystanders' murmurs and raised phones. As the car door closed behind her, Tara's mind raced, already strategizing her next move. This sets the stage for a powerful story with strong themes of resilience, justice, and ultimately, the karma that Daniels will face for his actions. The rest of the parts would dive deeper into how Tara responds, her allies within and outside the FBI, and the journey towards exposing and addressing Daniels' misconduct, providing both the inspirational arc and the much-deserved resolution. Let me know if you'd like to continue with this part in more detail or explore the next part. A test of resilience. As the patrol cars sped down the busy streets of Atlanta, Tara Johnson sat in the back, her wrists sore from the tight metal cuffs. The humiliation was unbearable, and yet she knew she couldn't afford to let it break her. Years of training had instilled in her a sense of discipline, and as an FBI agent, she had faced worse dangers. But this time, it wasn't a hardened criminal or a cartel leader testing her resolve. It was a man who wore the same uniform meant to symbolize justice. Officer Daniels was an emblem of a different, insidious kind of threat, one that fed off prejudice and power. Tara shifted uncomfortably in her seat, glancing out the window as the city blurred by. Her mind was racing with thoughts and questions. How would she explain this situation to her colleagues? What would her superiors think when they saw the footage of her, an FBI agent, arrested by a local officer in broad daylight? The mere idea of it all was infuriating, but she forced herself to focus. She couldn't let her emotions cloud her thinking. When they finally arrived at the precinct, Daniels yanked her out of the car, his grip unyielding. His demeanor seemed to swell with satisfaction, as though he was relishing every second of this power play. Tara fought to maintain her calm, keeping her head high as they walked into the building. She could feel the stares from other officers, some of whom seemed puzzled, others seemingly indifferent. No one questioned Daniel's actions. No one challenged his authority. Tara was reminded, yet again, of the unspoken codes and biases that allowed situations like these to unfold unchecked. Daniels led her into a small, dimly lit interrogation room and roughly gestured for her to sit down. He finally removed the cuffs, and Tara rubbed her wrists, glaring at him with silent defiance. The room was sparse, with only a metal table and 2 chairs, its cold sterility amplifying the tension between them. "Well," Daniels sneered as he leaned against the doorframe, crossing his arms, "I hope you enjoyed your little fantasy of being above the law." Tara looked him directly in the eye, her voice steady. "This isn't about the law, and we both know it." Her words seemed to pierce the facade of his smug confidence, and for a brief moment, Daniel's expression faltered. But he quickly recovered, a smirk tugging at the corners of his mouth. "You think you're some kind of hero, don't you? Flashing that FBI badge like it's a get-out-of-jail-free card." "Being an FBI agent isn't about power," she replied firmly. "It's about responsibility, something you don't seem to understand." Daniel's face twisted with anger, and he slammed a fist on the table, the sound echoing through the room. "Watch your mouth," he growled. "You don't get to lecture me." Tara felt a surge of anger, but managed to keep it in check. She knew men like Daniels thrived on intimidation and control, and she refused to give him the satisfaction of seeing her break. Instead, she leaned back in her chair, crossing her arms as she regarded him with a calmness that belied the storm within her. "Do you even realize what you've done?" she asked, her voice low but steady. "You've violated not only my rights but the trust and responsibility that come with your badge. There are people who sought everything, people who recorded it. Do you think they'll stay silent?" Daniels hesitated, his confidence flickering as her words took root, but his pride refused to let him back down. "You think people care. They see what I want them to see. A woman resisting authority. It doesn't matter what badge you carry or what authority you claim. On these streets, I'm the law." Tara's gaze hardened, and she could feel her resolve solidify. This wasn't just about her anymore. It was about the countless individuals who had faced similar injustices, their voices silenced, their rights dismissed. She was in a unique position to fight back, and she would not let this abuse of power go unchecked. Just then, the door swung open, and another officer entered the room. He was older, with graying hair and a calm demeanor that contrasted sharply with Daniel's aggression. His name tag read Lieutenant Marshall. He looked at Tara, then back at Daniels, his eyes narrowing with suspicion. "Daniels," Lieutenant Marshall said, his tone stern. "What's going on here? I just got wind that you brought in an FBI agent." Daniels straightened, trying to mask his irritation. She was resisting a lawful order. Tried to use her badge to get out of a routine traffic stop. Tara met Marshall's gaze, her calm demeanor never wavering. "Lieutenant, I identified myself as an FBI agent from the start. Officer Daniels ignored my badge and escalated the situation without cause. There was no resistance on my part, only compliance. He used unnecessary force and brought me in without any legal justification." Marshall's frown deepened, and he turned back to Daniels, who was visibly uncomfortable under his superior's scrutiny. "Daniels," Marshall said slowly, "is that true?" Daniels stammered, searching for words. She was being uncooperative. I thought she was impersonating an agent or something." Tara's patience wore thin. "Lieutenant, if you have access to the patrol footage, I suggest you review it. It will confirm everything I've said." Marshall studied her for a moment, then nodded. "I'll do that." He gave Daniels a pointed look. "In the meantime, I suggest you step out of the room." Daniels hesitated, clearly reluctant to leave, but one look from the lieutenant sent him out the door, his frustration evident in his rigid posture. Tara felt a small sense of relief as he left, but the weight of the situation remained. Lieutenant Marshall took a seat across from her, his expression shifting to one of genuine concern. "I apologize for what's happened, Agent Johnson," he said quietly. "I assure you, this is not how we operate." Tara's face softened slightly, but her resolve was unshaken. "Lieutenant, I've spent my career fighting to uphold the law. I didn't expect to have to defend myself against those who are supposed to do the same." Marshall nodded, his gaze thoughtful. "If what you've told me is true, then Daniels will face the consequences. I'll make sure of it." Tara took a deep breath, feeling the first glimmer of hope. But she knew words alone wouldn't be enough to right this wrong. "I appreciate that, Lieutenant. But I also need to ensure that this doesn't just get swept under the rug. There are too many people who have experienced this kind of treatment and never gotten justice." Marshall looked at her with a newfound respect. "Understood. I'll make sure you have access to the footage and any resources you need. This won't be buried." Tara nodded, grateful for his support, but aware that there was still a long road ahead. Daniels might face consequences within his department, but the larger issue of accountability and bias within law enforcement would take more than one disciplinary action to resolve. As she prepared to leave, Marshall extended a hand. "Thank you, Agent Johnson, for your courage. It's people like you who make a real difference." Tara shook his hand, her gaze steady. "This is only the beginning, Lieutenant." This chapter establishes Tara's resilience and introduces the first sign of justice in the form of Lieutenant Marshall. While she has gained an ally, she realizes that her battle is far from over, and her determination to address this injustice will drive her forward. In the following parts, Tara will continue her fight, facing both setbacks and breakthroughs, until the truth prevails. A call for justice. The tension of the previous encounter weighed heavily on Tara as she left the precinct, her mind brimming with a mix of frustration, determination, and strategic calculation. Lieutenant Marshall's support had been unexpected, a refreshing glimpse of integrity within a system that too often failed people like her. But Tara knew one ally was not enough to address the gravity of what had happened, nor would it be enough to dismantle the deep-seated bias she had just confronted. As soon as she was outside, Tara's phone buzzed with incoming messages. Word had already spread within her department about her arrest, the news traveling like wildfire. She ignored the notifications for the moment, opting instead to call her closest colleague and friend, Special Agent David Ramos, a fellow FBI agent known for his dedication to justice and for his tactical, unflappable nature in crisis. "David," she began as he answered, her voice steady despite the storm of emotions swirling within her. "I need your help." "Tara, I just heard. Are you okay?" David's voice was laced with concern, but Tara could also sense the underlying fury. "I'm fine, but there's a lot to unpack," she replied. "I need you to gather any contacts you have who can assist with an internal investigation. I can't let this incident go unchallenged. Officer Daniels abused his power, and if I, an FBI agent, can't hold him accountable, then what chance does anyone else have?" David didn't hesitate. "You can count on me, Tara. I'll start reaching out to my network immediately. We'll make sure this is handled at the highest levels." After hanging up, Tara took a deep breath, leaning against her car for a moment. She understood the path ahead wouldn't be easy, but she wasn't alone. Her colleagues and community could lend her the strength to face what was bound to be an uphill battle. The next morning, Tara entered the FBI headquarters with a calm resolve. The events of the previous day had already set the department abuzz, whispers of her arrest circulating in hushed tones as she passed through the corridors. Her supervisors had scheduled an emergency meeting to address the situation, and she could feel the weight of curious eyes on her as she made her way to the conference room. Inside, her supervisor, Deputy Director Michael Gaines, sat at the head of the table, flanked by a handful of other high-ranking officials and members of the Internal Affairs Division. Gaines, a man known for his fairness and commitment to justice, looked at her with a mixture of concern and empathy. As she took her seat, The room fell silent. "Tara," he began, his voice measured, "we've reviewed the footage and the preliminary report from Lieutenant Marshall. It's clear that Officer Daniels acted inappropriately, and I want you to know that the Bureau stands behind you." However, he paused, his expression becoming more serious. "Pursuing this case will bring significant attention, and it won't be easy." Tara met his gaze with unwavering determination. "I understand, sir, but I can't let this slide. This isn't just about me. There are countless people who face this kind of treatment daily and have no recourse. If we don't hold Officer Daniels accountable, then we're condoning his actions." One of the officials, a stern-faced woman from the Bureau's legal team, spoke up. "Agent Johnson, are you aware of the potential fallout? The press could turn this into a firestorm, especially considering the racial dynamics involved. The police union will likely rally behind Daniels, and this could spark backlash that impacts not just the Bureau, but you personally." Tara nodded, her expression resolute. "I'm prepared for that. My priority is to ensure justice is served, no matter the cost." Gaines sighed, but there was a glimmer of pride in his eyes. "Very well. We'll proceed with a formal complaint against Officer Daniels. The Internal Affairs Department will work in tandem with the local police's own investigation unit, and will open a case to examine patterns of misconduct within the precinct." Relief washed over Tara, but it was tempered by the knowledge that this was only the beginning. She thanked her supervisors and left the room, already planning her next steps. The following days were a whirlwind of activity. David and a few other trusted colleagues compiled reports, gathering statements from witnesses and examining every piece of footage they could obtain from the scene. They discovered that multiple bystanders had posted videos of the arrest on social media, each clip capturing the officer's aggressive demeanor and her repeated attempts to identify herself as an FBI agent. The videos quickly went viral, sparking outrage and igniting conversations about systemic bias in law enforcement. The public response was swift. People were furious, and calls for accountability filled news headlines and social media feeds. Activists and community leaders reached out to Tara, offering their support and amplifying her story. Within days, her case had garnered national attention, with media outlets broadcasting clips of the incident alongside headlines questioning the integrity of the police department. As public pressure mounted, Tara found herself inundated with interviews and speaking engagements. She agreed to appear on a prominent news program, determined to shed light on the systemic issues underlying her experience. Dressed in her professional best, Tara appeared calm and composed as she faced the camera, her words poised and powerful. "This isn't just about one officer and one interaction," she explained, her voice steady. "This is about a culture that allows individuals in positions of power to abuse their authority without accountability. I was fortunate to have my badge and the support of the FBI behind me, but there are countless people who face this treatment daily and don't have the resources or platform to fight back." The interview resonated with viewers, sparking a national debate on police accountability and systemic prejudice. But while the support was overwhelming, the backlash was equally intense. Daniels, backed by the police union, launched a counterattack, filing complaints that accused Tara of aggravated noncompliance and endangering public safety. He even claimed that she had brandished her badge in an intimidating and disrespectful manner. Tara refused to be intimidated. Supported by her colleagues, she continued to push forward, undeterred by Daniels' attempts to shift the blame. She filed a formal complaint with the precinct, requesting an internal investigation into his conduct and demanding that he be held accountable for his actions. Several weeks later, a hearing was scheduled, where both Tara and Daniels would present their cases. The room was filled with reporters, officials, and representatives from both the FBI and the police department. Tara sat at the front, her hands folded neatly in her lap as she prepared to face Daniels in what would be a pivotal moment in her fight for justice. Daniels entered the room, his expression defiant, flanked by his attorney and a few members of the police union. He exuded confidence, as if he believed his position would shield him from any repercussions. His attorney began by painting a picture of Daniels as a dedicated officer who had simply been doing his job, claiming that Tara's unusual behavior had warranted his response. Tara listened silently, her jaw clenched as she endured the attempt to twist the narrative. When it was her turn, she rose from her seat, addressing the board with a calm but authoritative voice. "I am an FBI agent who has spent years upholding the law," she began. "On that day, I did everything by the book. I identified myself, cooperated fully, and did nothing to justify Officer Daniels' excessive use of force. This is not just an isolated incident. It is a reflection of a larger issue within our law enforcement system, where certain individuals believe they can act without consequence." Her words echoed through the room, capturing the attention of everyone present. She detailed the events of that day, her voice unwavering as she recounted Daniels' disregard for her authority, his unnecessary aggression, and his refusal to acknowledge her badge. When she finished, there was a heavy silence. The board members exchanged glances, clearly impacted by her testimony. The weight of her words had cut through the usual legal jargon and defensive arguments, exposing the truth beneath. In the days that followed, the pressure on the police department intensified. Community leaders organized rallies demanding accountability, and even some officers within Daniels' own precinct began to speak out, acknowledging the systemic issues that had allowed his behavior to go unchecked. By the end of the hearing, the board made the decision to suspend Daniels pending a thorough investigation. While it was only the first step, it was a significant victory, a clear signal that change was possible. Tara knew there was still a long way to go, but as she walked out of the hearing, surrounded by supporters and colleagues, she felt a renewed sense of purpose. This fight wasn't over, and she was prepared to see it through, not just for herself, but for everyone who had been denied justice. The path was set, and Tara Johnson was ready to lead the charge, determined to dismantle the very system that had tried to undermine her. Unveiling the truth. As the suspension of Officer Daniels made headlines, Tara found herself at the center of a whirlwind. Her story had galvanized a movement, and people from all walks of life reached out, sharing their own harrowing experiences of bias and abuse at the hands of law enforcement. Her inbox overflowed with messages of support, as well as stories from individuals who felt inspired by her courage to finally speak up. Yet, amid the wave of solidarity, Tara knew her journey was far from over. She was determined to bring to light not just the specific injustices she had faced, but the broader systemic problems that allowed officers like Daniels to abuse their power. One evening, as she sat at her kitchen table sifting through files, David Ramos knocked on her door. He entered with a cautious smile, a thick file folder tucked under his arm. "I thought you could use some backup," he said, setting the folder down in front of her. Tara smiled gratefully. "You have no idea. This whole thing is bigger than I anticipated. I didn't think my case would resonate this much." David nodded, pulling out a chair and sitting across from her. "You're not just fighting for yourself, Tara. You're standing up for every person who's been silenced, intimidated, or ignored. People see that, and it's giving them hope." As they reviewed the materials together, David opened the folder he'd brought. Inside was a collection of internal police records and complaint logs from Daniels' precinct. The documents painted a disturbing picture: multiple complaints against Daniels and several other officers for excessive force, racial profiling, and unlawful searches. Yet each case had been quietly dismissed or resolved internally with little to no consequence. "These reports were buried," David said grimly, sliding a particularly damning complaint toward her. "It's clear that Daniels has a history of misconduct, but it looks like he had help keeping everything under wraps. Whoever's managing these reports has been protecting him." Tara's eyes hardened as she read through the files, her jaw clenched. This was bigger than Daniels. This was a coordinated cover-up. Her mind raced with possibilities as she considered how deep the corruption might go. If Daniels had allies protecting him within the department, there was no telling how far the rot extended. "How did you get these records?" she asked, glancing up at David. He leaned back, crossing his arms with a slight smirk. Let's just say I called in a few favors. It's amazing what people are willing to share when they believe in a cause. Tara chuckled, grateful for David's resourcefulness. Well, you just opened a can of worms, my friend. They spent hours dissecting the files, piecing together the patterns of misconduct that had been buried over the years. Each complaint, each disregarded report, each mishandled case represented a person whose life had been upended by abuse of power, and each one fueled Tara's determination to see this fight through. A few days later, Tara took the evidence to Lieutenant Marshall, who had been surprisingly cooperative since their last encounter. She arranged a private meeting, knowing that trust within law enforcement could be delicate, and aware that if anyone within the precinct was complicit in the cover-up, word of her investigation could jeopardize her progress. Marshall greeted her with a nod, his face serious as he gestured for her to sit. "Agent Johnson," he said, his voice low. "What do you have for me?" Tara placed the folder on the table, opening it to reveal the documented complaints. "Lieutenant, I've uncovered evidence that suggests Daniels has been shielded from accountability for years. There's a consistent pattern of complaints, all of which have been dismissed or minimized by someone within your department." Marshall's expression darkened as he scanned the records, the weight of each document settling over him like a lid blanket. This is serious. If this gets out, it could dismantle trust in our department." "Trust has already been broken," Tara replied firmly. "But you have a chance to be part of the solution. Daniels isn't the only officer implicated in these reports. If we want to root out corruption, we have to go after everyone involved." Marshall's eyes met hers, and she could see the internal struggle playing out in his mind. He took a deep breath, his shoulders tense. "I'll launch a formal investigation, but I'll need time. This kind of corruption doesn't unravel overnight." "Understood," she replied, her voice steady. "I appreciate your willingness to do the right thing." As she left the precinct, Tara knew she had just taken another monumental step forward. But her intuition told her that Daniels, and perhaps others in his network, wouldn't go down without a fight. If they were willing to cover up years of misconduct, they'd certainly try to protect themselves now. The following week, the pressure on Daniels and his allies intensified. The internal investigation launched by Lieutenant Marshall brought attention to the precinct, and Tara's story continued to gain traction in the media. Journalists unearthed additional cases of alleged misconduct within the department, painting a damning portrait of systemic issues that stretched far beyond one officer. Meanwhile, Tara and David received an unexpected invitation to meet with community leaders and activists who had been rallying around her case. The meeting took place in a small community center on Atlanta's South Side, a modest building where the walls were adorned with posters calling for justice, reform, and accountability. Inside, they were greeted by a diverse group of people: students, local activists, pastors, and retired civil rights leaders, all of whom had come together to support her fight. A woman named Lorna Brown, a well-known local activist, approached Tara and shook her hand firmly. "Agent Johnson," Lorna said with a warm smile, "we've been following your case closely. You've done something incredible by standing up against the system, and we want you to know that the community has your back." Tara's eyes softened with gratitude. "Thank you, Lorna. I'm doing everything I can, but I know I can't do it alone." "That's why we're here," Lorna replied, motioning for her to sit with the others. "We want to help you not just with this case, but with addressing the larger issues. This is an opportunity for real change, and we can't let it slip through our fingers." The meeting was filled with powerful stories of resilience, loss, and hope. People shared their own encounters with police misconduct, some of which mirrored Tara's experience, and many spoke of loved ones who had been failed by the justice system. They discussed strategies for organizing protests, hosting forums to educate the community, and pressuring city officials to implement lasting reforms within law enforcement. As the meeting went on, Tara felt her resolve deepen. These weren't just allies, They were people whose lives and communities were directly affected by the injustices she was fighting to expose. Their support gave her a sense of purpose that went beyond personal vindication. She was fighting for them, for every person whose story had been silenced, for every voice that had been disregarded. Late one night, after weeks of building evidence and rallying support, Tara received a phone call from Lieutenant Marshall. His voice was grave. "Tara, I think you need to know. Daniels has been trying to retaliate. He's spreading rumors, trying to discredit you within the precinct. He's claiming you're using your position to make a name for yourself, that this is all just a personal vendetta." Tara clenched her fist, her resolve only hardening. Let him say what he wants. The evidence speaks for itself. He can try to smear my reputation, but it won't change the truth. Marshall sighed, his voice heavy with frustration. "I know, and I'm with you. But be careful. We're getting closer to something big, and Daniels knows it. Desperation can make people dangerous." Hanging up the phone, Tara took a moment to reflect on his warning. She knew that exposing the truth would come at a cost, but she was prepared to face whatever obstacles lay ahead. Her community, her colleagues, and her integrity all depended on her ability to see this fight through to the end. The following morning, Tara awoke to a flurry of notifications on her phone. David had sent her an urgent message. "Check the news. Daniels just released a statement." In the statement, Daniels painted himself as a victim of a misunderstanding and accused Tara of overstepping her authority and exploiting her position for personal gain. His statement was laced with subtle implications, casting doubt on Tara's intentions and positioning himself as the target of an unjust witch hunt. But Tara was ready. With David's support, she organized a press conference, determined to address Daniels' accusations head-on. Standing before a sea of reporters and flashing cameras, she delivered a powerful speech that resonated across the nation. "Today, Officer Daniels attempted to discredit my character, but this isn't about me. This is about accountability, transparency, and justice for everyone who has been failed by a system that permits unchecked abuses of power. We're not backing down, and we will not be intimidated." As she spoke, the crowd grew silent, captivated by her strength and conviction. With each word, Tara dismantled Daniels' narrative, leaving no doubt about her commitment to justice. And as the press conference concluded, she knew that her message had struck a chord. Tara Johnson had become more than just a name in a headline. She was now a symbol of resilience and hope for a community and a country hungry for change. The path ahead remained uncertain, but Tara felt an unbreakable resolve within her. She would stand firm, and she would fight, not only for herself, but for the countless lives affected by the very system she had sworn to protect. Turning the tide. The backlash from Daniels' public statement was swift, igniting a firestorm of controversy. News outlets and social media exploded with debates over Tara's intentions, Daniels' actions, and the broader issue of law enforcement accountability. Supporters rallied around Tara, their voices loud and resolute, while Daniels' defenders painted her as an instigator, a threat to the honor of the police force. It was a vicious tug-of-war, and Tara could feel the weight of public scrutiny bearing down on her. But she remained undeterred. This fight was no longer about her reputation. It was about a legacy of injustice she was determined to help dismantle. One night, as she was leaving the office, her phone rang. It was Lieutenant Marshall. "Agent Johnson," he said, his voice quiet but urgent. "I have something you need to see. Can you meet me at the precinct in an hour? I'll be in the archives room." Tara's pulse quickened. Over the past few weeks, Marshall had been an invaluable ally, uncovering leads and working tirelessly to piece together a case that could stand up to scrutiny. If he was asking her to meet in person, it could only mean he had found something important. She arrived at the precinct an hour later, her heart pounding as she navigated the quiet halls. She found Marshall in a dimly lit room surrounded by rows of filing cabinets and boxes tacked high with paperwork. He waved her over, his expression tense. "I've been digging through old internal records, "And I found something you need to see," he said, gesturing to a stack of documents on the table. "These are Daniel's personnel records from over the years, and they're troubling, to say the least." Tara sat down, her eyes scanning the files. They revealed a history of excessive force incidents, racial profiling complaints, and conduct violations, all either dismissed or given a slap on the wrist. More disturbingly, several of these records bore the signatures of high-ranking officers, people who had clearly been complicit in shielding Daniels from accountability. As she read, Tara's mind raced. This wasn't just a case of one corrupt cop. It was a network of people who had actively worked to protect him, turning a blind eye to his repeated misconduct. And now she finally had proof. "Do you realize what this means?" Marshall asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Tara nodded, her eyes blazing with determination. "It means we're going after more than just Daniels. This is a conspiracy. We're talking about a cover-up that implicates half the precinct." Marshall exhaled slowly, his face grim. "This won't be easy. Daniels has friends in high places, and they won't go down without a fight. But I'm with you. Whatever it takes, I'll help you see this through." Tara reached out, gripping his hand firmly. "Thank you, Lieutenant. I couldn't do this without you." Together, they spent hours organizing the files, making copies of everything that could be used as evidence. By the time they finished, the room was filled with stacks of documents that painted a chilling portrait of corruption, negligence, and abuse of power. This was more than just a case. It was a reckoning. In the days that followed, Tara and Marshall launched a full-scale investigation, interviewing witnesses, reviewing surveillance footage, and gathering statements from former officers who had left the precinct under suspicious circumstances. As they dug deeper, they uncovered a disturbing pattern. Daniels had often been assigned to minority neighborhoods, where his aggressive tactics had gone unchecked, and his behavior had even been encouraged by some of his superiors. It was a deliberate strategy, a policy of intimidation aimed at controlling certain communities. The findings were both enraging and heartbreaking. Tara thought of all the lives that had been disrupted, all the people who had suffered under a system that had prioritized control over justice, and she knew she couldn't let them down. One evening, as she sat in her office reviewing the case files, her phone buzzed with a message from David. "Got something big. Need you to see this ASAP." They met at a nearby cafe, where David pulled out his laptop and opened a video file. "I got this from a source who used to work with Daniels. It's footage from a dashcam that was never filed with the precinct's official records." Tara leaned in, watching as the video played. It showed Daniels pulling over a young black man for what appeared to be a minor traffic violation. As the man calmly explained that he hadn't done anything wrong, Daniels grew increasingly aggressive, eventually dragging him out of the car and pinning him to the ground. The man pleaded for help, his voice breaking with fear, but Daniels ignored him, his face twisted in a sneer. Tara's stomach churned as she watched, fury building with each second of the footage. This was incontrovertible evidence of Daniel's cruelty and his absolute disregard for human dignity. It was also clear that this video had been deliberately hidden to protect him. David closed the laptop, his expression somber. "This is it, Tara. This is the smoking gun. With this, there's no way Daniels can claim he was acting within the bounds of the law." She nodded, her mind already racing with plans. "We're going public with this. It's time people saw the truth." The following day, Tara held a press conference. The crowd was larger than she had anticipated, filled with reporters, activists, community members, and even some law enforcement officials who had come to show their support. She could feel the tension in the air as she stepped up to the podium, the weight of her decision pressing down on her shoulders. "Good afternoon," she began, her voice steady. "Today, I am releasing evidence that reveals not only the misconduct of Officer Daniels, but a pattern of systemic abuse within his precinct. The video you are about to see is disturbing, but it is necessary for the public to understand the depth of the injustice that has been allowed to persist." She signaled to a technician, who began playing the dashcam footage on a large screen behind her. As the crowd watched, a collective gasp rippled through the audience, followed by murmurs of anger and disbelief. The sight of Daniel's brutality, laid bare for everyone to see, was a shock that no one could ignore. When the video ended, Tara looked out at the crowd, her gaze unwavering. This is only one example of the abuse that has gone unchecked for years. Officer Daniels has a history of misconduct that has been repeatedly covered up by those who were meant to hold him accountable. This is not just an isolated incident. It is a failure of the entire system, and I will not stop until justice is served. As the press conference concluded, the public outcry reached a fever pitch. Protests erupted across the city, with people demanding an overhaul of the precinct and accountability for every officer involved in the cover-up. Activists organized rallies, community leaders held town halls, and calls for police reform echoed through the streets. Tara had sparked a movement, and the people of Atlanta were rising up to join her. Amid the public pressure, city officials launched an independent investigation into the precinct, and several high-ranking officers were placed on administrative leave. Daniels, faced with mounting evidence and an impending trial, went into hiding, his reputation in shambles. The police union, once a powerful shield for officers like him, struggled to defend his actions in the face of undeniable proof. Despite the progress, Tara knew the fight wasn't over. She continued working tirelessly, determined to see this case through to its conclusion. Each day brought new challenges, new threats from those who sought to protect the status quo. But Tara refused to back down. She had come too far to let fear or intimidation stop her now. Late one night, as she reviewed the final pieces of evidence for Daniel's trial, she received a message from Marshall. "We got them. Internal Affairs just issued arrest warrants for 3 officers linked to the cover-up." This is the beginning of the end. A wave of relief washed over her, followed by a renewed sense of purpose. This was the justice she had fought for, the accountability that so many had been denied. And while it was only one battle in a much larger war, it was a victory that would send ripples of change throughout the community. The day of Daniel's trial arrived, and the courtroom was packed with people who had come to witness the outcome. Tara sat in the front row, her heart pounding as the proceedings began. Witnesses testified to Daniel's history of misconduct, and the prosecution presented the dashcam footage, along with the damning evidence from the personnel records. When the verdict was finally delivered, a hush fell over the room. The judge's voice was clear and resolute as he declared Daniels guilty on multiple counts of assault, misconduct, and abuse of power. The courtroom erupted in applause, and Tara felt tears of relief welling in her eyes. Justice had been served. As she left the courthouse, she was greeted by a crowd of supporters, their faces filled with gratitude and admiration. She shook hands, exchanged hugs, and felt a profound sense of fulfillment. This was more than a victory for her. It was a victory for everyone who had suffered under a broken system, a reminder that change was possible. Tara looked out at the crowd, her heart swelling with pride and determination. She knew there was still much work to be done, but for the first time, she felt hopeful. This was only the beginning, and she was ready for the battles that lay ahead. Tara Johnson had become a force to be reckoned with, a beacon of justice and resilience. And with the support of her community, she knew they would continue to fight, together, for a better future. The ripple effect. The trial of Officer Daniels and the ensuing convictions of those involved in the cover-up marked a watershed moment in Atlanta's history. Tara's victory wasn't just a personal triumph. It was a testament to the power of courage, resilience, and community. The conviction sent a powerful message. Corruption and abuse would no longer be tolerated. But as Tara stood in the aftermath of this hard-won justice, she knew the fight for meaningful, lasting change was far from over. In the weeks following the trial, Tara continued to work closely with Lieutenant Marshall and David Ramos to help implement a reform agenda aimed at rebuilding trust between the police and the community. The first step was a citywide review of all active and closed cases with records of excessive force and misconduct, along with an independent oversight committee composed of both law enforcement professionals and respected community members. Tara was asked to help lead this committee, a role she accepted with a sense of responsibility and hope. The committee meetings took place at City Hall, where officials, activists, and law enforcement representatives met to discuss new policies and review cases that had long been buried in bureaucracy. Each case was a new story, a reminder of why she had started this journey. Many cases had heartbreaking details, individuals and families who had experienced trauma, betrayal, and loss because of unchecked authority. Tara's heart broke for them, but she also felt renewed strength in knowing that they could finally find the justice they deserved. One evening, after a particularly long committee meeting, Tara found herself alone in the nearly empty council chamber, reviewing a stack of documents. She was lost in thought when a voice interrupted her. Tara. She looked up to see Lorna Brown, the community activist who had been instrumental in rallying support around her case. Lorna walked over, her expression filled with warmth and gratitude. "I just wanted to thank you, Tara," Lorna said, sitting beside her. "You've given us hope. I've been fighting for change for years, and for the first time, it feels like people are really listening. It feels like something's finally shifting." Tara smiled, reaching over to take Lorna's hand. "I couldn't have done this alone. It was the community, people like you, who stood up and refused to be silenced. That's what made the difference." Lorna nodded, her gaze growing somber. "We've come a long way, but there's still so much to be done. There are too many people in this city, and in this country, who've suffered because of injustice, because of a system that protects those in power instead of protecting the people." Tara felt the weight of Lorna's words, the truth in them resonating deeply. "I know," she replied softly, "but we've shown that change is possible. We've created a foundation, and now it's up to us to build on it." Lorna squeezed her hand, her eyes shining with hope. "Then let's keep building, Tara. Let's make this the beginning of something bigger." In the following months, the reform agenda gained momentum. The committee implemented a series of changes, including mandatory de-escalation training for all officers, body camera requirements, and a clear disciplinary process that ensured accountability. To oversee these reforms, a new community oversight board was created, a civilian-led council with the authority to review complaints against officers and recommend disciplinary action when necessary. It was a radical departure from the old ways, a shift toward transparency and community-centered policing. Through her work with the Oversight Board, Tara witnessed the slow but steady transformation of the precinct. Officers who had once been loyal to Daniels and his network were either disciplined or removed from their positions. New recruits were vetted not only for their skills but for their commitment to serving with integrity and respect. Tara worked closely with the department's new leadership to cultivate a culture of accountability, emphasizing that the badge was a privilege, not a shield from consequence. As the reforms took hold, trust between the community and the police began to grow. Neighborhood meetings were held where residents could speak openly with officers about their concerns, fostering dialogue and understanding. Programs were launched to address mental health, poverty, and addiction, underlying issues that had often led to tense encounters with law enforcement. It was a holistic approach, one that addressed the root causes of conflict rather than just the symptoms. One day, during one of these community meetings, Tara encountered a young man named Marcus, who had been a victim of Daniel's aggression years earlier. Marcus was quiet, almost withdrawn, but as he listened to Tara and the new officers discuss the changes being implemented, he raised his hand to speak. "I didn't think I'd ever see the day when something like this would happen," Marcus said, his voice trembling. "When Officer Daniels arrested me, I felt like I was just another target, like my life didn't matter. But seeing all of you here, working together, it gives me hope that maybe things can change." Tara felt a lump rise in her throat as she listened to him. Marcus was exactly the kind of person she had been fighting for, someone whose dignity and humanity had been disregarded by a system that had once prioritized control over compassion. And now, here he was, bearing witness to a new era of justice and accountability. As the months turned into a year, the reforms in Atlanta began to draw national attention. Other cities, inspired by Tara's efforts, started exploring similar changes within their own police departments. The story of her battle with Daniels and the subsequent transformation of the Atlanta precinct became a case study, a symbol of what was possible when people united to demand accountability. Tara was invited to speak at conferences, town halls, and universities across the country, sharing her story and encouraging others to fight for justice in their communities. Despite the accolades and attention, Tara remained grounded. She had always been driven by a simple truth. Justice wasn't just a concept. It was a responsibility. It was a commitment to standing up for the vulnerable, to challenging corruption, and to ensuring that everyone, regardless of their background or status, was treated with dignity and respect. She knew there were still battles to be fought, still voices that needed to be heard, but she was ready to keep going. One evening, Tara received a letter in the mail from a young girl named Amara, who had followed her story in the news. Amara wrote about how she had once dreamed of becoming an FBI agent, but had been discouraged by the stories of discrimination and injustice she had seen in her own community. But after watching Tara's journey, she felt inspired again. "You showed me that there's a place for people like us in this fight for justice," Amara wrote. "Thank you for not giving up, even when it was hard. Because of you, I believe I can make a difference too." Tara felt tears prick her eyes as she read the letter. Amara's words were a reminder of why she had chosen this path, of the lives she had touched, and the hope she had helped ignite. In that moment, she knew that her journey had come full circle. She had fought for justice not only for herself, but for the generations that would follow, for young girls like Amara who deserved to grow up in a world where justice was not just a dream but a reality. One afternoon, as Tara walked through the community she had helped transform, she noticed a mural on the side of a building. It was a vibrant painting, depicting people of all backgrounds standing together in solidarity, their hands raised in a symbol of unity. At the center of the mural was a figure that looked strikingly familiar, a woman with a badge, her face filled with determination, her eyes fixed on the horizon. Tara smiled as she took in the mural, a sense of pride swelling in her chest. She hadn't set out to become a symbol, but she had become one nonetheless. Her fight had transcended her own life, becoming a beacon for others, a reminder that justice was worth fighting for, no matter the cost. As she stood before the mural, a voice called out to her. She turned to see Lieutenant Marshall approaching. His face softened with a rare smile. "I thought you might be here," he said, joining her in admiring the mural. "They say heroes don't wear capes, but I think you've proven that sometimes they wear badges." Tara chuckled, shaking her head. "I'm no hero, Marshall. I just did what was right." He nodded, a look of respect in his eyes. "And that's exactly what makes you one." They stood in silence, both of them reflecting on the journey that had brought them to this moment. Tara knew the fight for justice would continue, that there would always be new challenges to face, new battles to win. But she was ready, and she knew that with people like Marshall, David, and the community by her side, there was nothing they couldn't accomplish. As the sun began to set, casting a warm glow over the mural, Tara felt a deep sense of peace. She had found her purpose, and she had made a difference. And as long as there were people who needed her, she would keep fighting, keep striving for justice, knowing that each step forward brought them closer to a world where everyone could walk free from fear, embraced by the promise of equality and dignity. This was her legacy, a legacy of courage, resilience, and hope. And she knew it would endure, lighting the way for others, a testament to the unbreakable power of justice. Building a legacy. A year had passed since the landmark trial that had brought Officer Daniels and his network of corruption to justice, but Tara's work was far from over. Her role on the Community Oversight Board had expanded, and she was now seen not only as a reformer, but as a bridge between law enforcement and the people they served. Yet, while the reforms had sparked change in Atlanta, Tara felt a growing pull to take her work to the national level, where systemic change was desperately needed. One afternoon, as she sat in her office reviewing new cases, she received a call from a familiar voice. Deputy Director Michael Gaines. Since her case, Gaines had become an ardent supporter of Tara's work, recognizing the profound impact she was having beyond the Bureau. He didn't waste time on pleasantries, getting straight to the point. "Tara, I've been following your progress, and I have an opportunity that I think is right up your alley," he began. "We're setting up a new division within the FBI to address issues of police accountability and civil rights abuses across the country. We need someone with experience, someone who can handle the complex dynamics of law enforcement reform. Someone like you." Tara was silent for a moment, absorbing the magnitude of the offer. A national division focused on police accountability would be a groundbreaking step toward addressing the systemic issues that plagued the country. But it was also an enormous responsibility, one that would place her at the forefront of a polarizing movement. "What exactly would my role be?" she asked, her voice steady but her heart racing. "You would lead the division," Gaines replied. "Your work in Atlanta has set a precedent, and the Bureau believes you're the best person to bring that vision to a broader stage. This would mean working with departments nationwide, reviewing misconduct cases, training officers on de-escalation, and building relationships with community organizations. We want to create a model of law enforcement that respects and protects every citizen, and you've already proven you can make that happen." Tara took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the decision settle on her. She had dedicated her life to this cause, and the opportunity to effect change on a national scale was both thrilling and daunting. But she knew, in her heart, that this was what she had been preparing for all along. "Deputy Director Gaines, I'm honored," she replied, her voice filled with conviction. "I accept." In the months that followed, Tara threw herself into the work of building the new division. She assembled a team of like-minded agents, many of whom were former civil rights attorneys, community activists, and reform-minded officers who believed in the mission as passionately as she did. Together, they laid the groundwork for a division that would bring accountability and transparency to law enforcement practices across the nation. Her first major task was to establish partnerships with local community organizations and advocacy groups. She knew that real change required more than just policy. It required collaboration and trust. Tara traveled to cities with long histories of tension between police and communities of color, meeting with grassroots leaders who had been fighting for justice long before her name had appeared in the headlines. In Chicago, she met with a group of mothers who had lost children to police violence, their eyes reflecting years of grief and resilience. In Los Angeles, she sat down with former gang members who were now community mentors, helping to prevent young people from falling into cycles of violence. In Baltimore, she held a forum with local activists who were weary of broken promises, but willing to trust her if she proved her commitment. Each meeting was a lesson, a reminder that the fight for justice was a mosaic of countless stories and struggles. Tara listened to their concerns, taking careful notes and committing to honor their voices in the policies her division would develop. Back in Washington, D.C., Tara and her team drafted a comprehensive plan for the division's mission. They introduced new protocols for handling complaints against officers, ensuring that every allegation would be investigated by an independent body. They created a national database of officers with histories of misconduct, preventing them from moving to new departments without accountability. They even implemented a program that allowed community members to serve as advisors in police training, bringing a new perspective to law enforcement education. But despite her efforts, Tara faced resistance from various corners. Police unions, influential politicians, and even some within the Bureau itself questioned the need for such sweeping reforms. They accused her of being anti-law enforcement, of undermining the authority of officers who risked their lives every day. One evening, after a grueling day of meetings with law enforcement representatives, Tara found herself feeling frustrated and overwhelmed. She had known this work would be difficult, but the constant pushback was exhausting. It was in these moments that doubt crept in, whispering that perhaps the fight was too big, that perhaps change was too far out of reach. That night, she received a call from David Ramos, who had remained one of her closest confidants despite his promotion and transfer to another city. Sensing her weariness, David spoke words of encouragement, reminding her of the lives she had already changed, the walls she had already broken down. "Tara, remember that this fight isn't just about winning people over. It's about setting a standard, showing people that it's possible to build a system that's truly just. You've already done it once. Now you're just doing it on a bigger scale." His words bolstered her resolve, and the next day, Tara returned to her work with renewed determination. She knew that change wouldn't happen overnight, but she also knew that each step forward was a victory. With each policy they implemented, with each meeting they held, they were laying the foundation for a more just and equitable future. One of the division's first successes came when they partnered with a major city police department to implement a pilot program on de-escalation training. The program was designed to replace the traditional use of force model with techniques that emphasized communication, empathy, and conflict resolution. Officers learned to recognize signs of mental health crisis, to approach tense situations with calmness, and to use force only as a last resort. The results were staggering. Within a year, incidents of police violence in the city dropped by nearly 40%, and complaints of excessive force plummeted. The community noticed the difference, and for the first time in years, trust between the police and the public began to rebuild. The success of the program caught national attention, and other cities began to request Tara's guidance in implementing similar changes. Slowly but surely, her division became a model for reform, a beacon of hope for communities that had long felt abandoned by the justice system. One day, as she was preparing for a meeting, Tara received a message from Amara, the young girl who had written her that heartfelt letter months earlier. Amara had been inspired by Tara's journey to pursue her own career in law enforcement, and she had recently been accepted into the FBI's youth mentorship program. "I want to be an agent like you someday," Amara wrote. "Someone who fights for justice, who makes things better for everyone." Reading those words, Tara felt a swell of pride and emotion. She realized that the impact of her work extended far beyond policy and reform. She was inspiring a new generation, showing young people like Amara that they, too, had a place in the fight for justice, that they could be part of building a system that served everyone. The thought brought tears to her eyes, and she made a silent promise to continue this work, not just for herself, but for Amara and all the young people who believed in the power of change. Years passed, and Tara's division grew into one of the most respected and effective units in the Bureau. Her work had sparked a nationwide movement, leading to legislation that made police accountability a priority, protecting communities and restoring faith in the justice system. She received numerous awards and accolades, but she remained humble, knowing that the true reward was the lives she had touched, the communities she had helped heal. One day, as she prepared to speak at a national summit on law enforcement reform, she spotted a familiar face in the audience, Lieutenant Marshall. He had retired from the Atlanta precinct and now worked as an advisor on police reform, inspired by the changes he had seen under Tara's leadership. After her speech, he approached her, a proud smile on his face. "You did it, Tara. You changed the world." She shook her head, a soft smile playing on her lips. "We did it, Marshall. None of this would have happened without you and everyone who believed in this cause." As they stood together, looking out at the crowd of advocates, officers, and community members who had gathered to continue the work she had started, Tara felt a profound sense of fulfillment. She had devoted her life to justice, to building a legacy that would outlast her, a legacy rooted in resilience, integrity, and the unwavering belief that change was possible. And as she looked out at the future leaders, the young people who would carry this torch forward, she knew that her journey had come full circle. The world was a better place because of her work, and she could finally rest in the knowledge that the fight for justice would continue, stronger and more resolute than ever. This was her legacy, a legacy of courage, compassion, and hope. And it was a legacy that would endure for generations to come.